Okay, so this is part 2 of the $10,000 challenge. My personal responses. I am in no way representing Wasset. His responses will be his own responses. If you haven't seen part 1 of this, then go back and watch part 1. Don't just watch part 2. Watch part 1 as well. In part 1, I took care of number 1, in my opinion. Number 2, took care of most of that. The only thing that I would add to part 2 is the fact that when you look at the full consensus of what the 42 Confessions of Mayat are saying, especially when they're talking about how you are to take care of your family, take care of your community, your neighbor. When you think about it critically, I cannot be a person who does not lie, who does not steal, who does not harm the neighbor, who does not take care of the gods, who doesn't maintain the ritual rites, who does not obey the law. It says to obey the law. If I disobey, I can't honor my mother and my father if I am not doing those things. But if I'm refraining from doing those things, I can honor my mother and father. That's what I meant to say, that I am honoring my mother and father. So to say that it doesn't specifically say it, yeah, you can match up: do not steal, I have not stolen; do not kill, I have not murdered. You can match those up easily. But it takes a bit of critical thinking to be able to say that, all right, if a person is, what is dishonoring your mother and your father according to the Bible? Yes, it says explicitly, do not dishonor your mother and father. But it talks about later on in your Bible about being an obedient child, that about honoring the ancestors, about honoring the rituals and the rites and the holidays, and taking care of your parents in their old age. Those are the things that are honoring your mother and father. You being a good person is the biggest one. Who you are as a person, at the end of the day, is the honor or dishonor of your mother and your father. So in the 42 negative confessions of Mayat, if I have not murdered, if I have not stolen, if I have not committed adultery, if I have not disobeyed the gods, if I have not broken the law, then the person that I am is a person who honors my mother and my father. You see the critical thinking of how that works. And if you can't understand that, no disrespect, then that just shows the level of your ability to critically think, or it just demonstrates your your conscious dissonance, or and you just refuse to accept it because you just don't want to. Now, moving on to your third one, which is also going to be part of what somebody else was saying. You're claiming that you said, AKA, you can not prove it to be true or false, thus invalidates the claim. That's not necessarily true. That's not necessarily true. All right, so initially, most people, and I'm going to start far back and come forward. Initially, most people claim that the historical Jesus existed because contemporaries, non-religious contemporaries, wrote about Jesus. So they will throw up people like Tacitus and Pliny and people of that nature. Well, if you throw up people like Tacitus writing about Jesus 120 years after Jesus existed, he wasn't really writing about Jesus. He was writing about what people believe. He was writing a letter to Pliny about what to do with the Christians, and that these Christians believe in a man named Jesus or Yeshua, that they believe in this person. He's not, and whether or not he should charge them with any types of sedition. He is not validating that Jesus existed. He's validating what people believed. Pliny is doing the same thing. And if you accept that as proof, then you have to say that Serapis exists, because Tacitus wrote about Serapis and him through Vespasian doing miracles of healing a blind man and healing a lame man, in the same way that you have in the story of your Gospels. And even when he wrote about Serapis, this was written decades after it supposedly happened. So we see the tendency to do that. Now, moving closer to the time frame, we can get to Josephus. Josephus wrote about 4 different Jesuses, 4 different Yeshuas that he wrote about. And we know that the Testimonium Flavianus is a forgery. that it was placed in there in the 4th century and is not actually Josephus's writing or his works. So therefore, the 4 different Jesuses doesn't account for your biblical Jesus, because none of the 4 different Jesuses performed any of these miracles and things of that. People claimed he did, but there is no proof that he actually did any of these types of miracles. Now, prior to Josephus, because Josephus wasn't born until a few years after Jesus supposedly was crucified. Tacitus wasn't born until a couple of decades later. He was born in 55 AD. So none of them were writing at the time frame that this Jesus supposedly existed, but they were writing much, 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 much later when they began their writings. So therefore, they are not witnesses themselves, neither of the Gospels. The Gospels are not witnessing of anything, and no other historians. And there were at least 125 able-bodied writing historians in the area at that time, and not one of them wrote about that Jesus. There is, and you're going to say, well, that's the absence of evidence, but the evidence actually shows that this Jesus character wasn't around, because for Jesus to have been born, according to your Bible actually shows, compared to real history, that Jesus don't exist. Your Bible, in one version, says that Jesus was born at the time frame of a census by the governor Quirinius. That happened in 666 CE. So that was in Mark. The Matthew version says that he was born and King Herod was ruling over Judea, and King Herod died no later than 4 BCE. So there is at minimum a 10-year gap between when Jesus should have been born. If he was born during the census, Herod was already dead, so then that would invalidate the entire story of Matthew. If he was born during the reign of King Herod, then that would invalidate the entire birth story in Mark. And the whole Egypt things and all that stuff goes along with it. So it actually shows and demonstrates that your Jesus never existed, that he is a fairy tale creature. And that's why they was able to make up what they was able to make up, because he was a fairy tale creature. And everything was written decades and if not centuries after this supposedly character had began his creation or supposedly walk. So that actually shows that Jesus does not exist, did not exist. Because even within your own Bible, you can't even get it straight. And then there are 0 records that demonstrates a Jesus, but there are plenty of records that demonstrates Messiah-type characters who were in existence at that time frame. And I want to go into this other guy's statement as well. Now, he pretty much says some of the same things that the other guy was saying about Mayat and the confessions and all that. And he's talking about, and the Jesus and Christian historians saying the same, and the whole group of Jews who decided to follow his teachings ain't enough. So what I wanted to take from his is the fact that because a bunch of people agree on something does not validate it to be true. This is one, and the reason why I wanted his comment on here, because one of the things that we have to be mindful of is that people often get caught up into the movement of something, caught up into the thought process of something, because it's common or because it invokes some type of emotion. The same way we have a lot of people who are caught up into the whole MAGA thing, but yet when they are questioned on the street, they know very little information about what they're actually following. When I lived in Germany, I can tell you that I met hundreds of people who were embarrassed and ashamed that they got caught up into the whole German war machine and didn't even really know what they were doing. They just following the whole thing, and they were very much ashamed. So being caught up into a movement and believing in it your entire life doesn't necessarily validate it, because if that's the case, then Zeus is real, Dionysus is real, Ra is real, Isis is real, Quetzalcoatl is real. Every god then becomes god, and goddess then becomes real, because at any given moment there were millions of people who believed in those deities, And there were millions of people who died for those deities. So even when you say people died and were persecuted, you can find people dying and persecuting for many religions. So always remember, you got to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non